Totally. Sorry if I'm shouting at the front. I have two volumes. One of them is like inside volume and one of them is screaming at my dog volume. So if I drop into the inside volume and you can't hear me, just start waving. So we've been doing these talks at different places around the state, and that means we never have any idea what the venue is going to be until we show up. So we're going to do our best. We might have some technical issues, so please be patient with us. This is as large as we can get the image, but the image is mostly just so that you have something to stare at besides us, because we're not that exciting to look at. And we have sound clips are mostly what we're doing with this presentation is actually showing some or playing some of the sound clips from the different interviews and then talking about the different themes, that come up. So the sound clips have to go through a sound system, so we're going to, hopefully it'll be loud enough. That's where if you can't hear those as well, let us know. Worst case, if we can't get them to broadcast loud enough, we'll just explain what was just played. So please bear with us. So welcome, thank you guys for showing up today. And for so many of you who participated or had family members who participated, welcome to this talk. The purpose of this presentation is to talk about our project, which is focused on remembering life in rural New Mexico. The name of the project is the New Mexico Rural Heritage Oral History Project, which presumably most, if not all of you are familiar, especially if you were involved in the project, and I know a number of you were. Our goal was to collect oral history interviews from people who grew up in rural parts of the state, remembering what it was like to live in those environments, especially from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, up through the 60s, and in some cases we drifted even a little bit later because the conversation was too good. And that is what we're trying to share with you today. So if you haven't met either one of us or one or the other of us, my name is Kelly Jenks. This is Mary Alice Scott. We're the two people who started this project. I'm a historical archaeologist, so I'm really familiar with working with old ruins and ranches and old privy pits, all the exciting stuff, and then trying to reconstruct what life was like and how people were using these different items. So for me, this project was really interesting because it gives me insight into what people remember about living there, and it can help me understand sites of that era and sites from earlier eras better than I would otherwise. Mary Alice Scott, my colleague, is a medical anthropologist. We're both at New Mexico State University in the Department of Anthropology. She has a very different but related interest to me, which is partially, we both kind of come from rural backgrounds, but also she's interested in how people understand health. So medical anthropology is understanding medicine and health and treatment, but in terms of how people understand their own health, what remedies they come up with, what they consider to be well or unwell. And so there was a lot of the things that came up in interviews that were focused on kind of how people handled illness, what they thought of as serious injuries, which is remarkable, the things that have been considered not serious at all, like partially almost taking off a leg was apparently not that big of a deal to some of our participants. And so between the two of us, we created this project to collect these stories that help us get insight into a lot of the things that don't make it into the bigger history books, right? People talk a lot about the big events in history. They don't often talk about what it meant when you lived it, some of those lived experiences around those big events, but they almost never talk about the day-to-day, mundane, what happened when you got a flu. Where did you go to the bathroom? Archaeologists care about these things because we find the evidence after the fact. So that's what led us to do this project. We did 27 interviews over the last summer and a little bit into the fall. And these interviews are all about 2 hours, and so we ended up with a lot of information, a lot of interviews. We can't possibly share everything in any of these talks, so what we've done is create talks that focus on the people who are in that area or who are likely going to be able to attend this talk. And so for this talk, based upon the feedback that we got, we highlighted the interviews that are listed here. So Bronson Springstead, David Duran, Felipe Baca, Renee Martinez, Luis Gabaldon, Lucille Wolf, Lucinda Vigil, Richard Chavez, and Rick Simpson. are the interviews that we have selected clips from in this one. Some people, we have clips from in other ones, especially, Jerry, I know you had talks or clips that were from Las Cruces, so we played a number of them at the Las Cruces talk. So if you're not being highlighted here, you're probably being highlighted in one of our other talks. The audio files from these interviews are going to be available at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum in Las Cruces. So it's a state-run museum. They are going to keep the original audio files so people can travel to get them. They are helping us by doing the difficult work of actually transcribing the interviews. And so once those transcriptions are complete, our goal with them is to make them not only available to people who come to the museum, but to also make them available online so that people who don't live in or near Las Cruces can access those as well. And so it's going to be with our partner with the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum that these will be more widely available. The last thing I have to just make clear is that our work has been funded in part by the New Mexico Humanities Council. It gave us gas money to go driving to visit many of you guys to do these interviews, and also by the Loomis Fund at New Mexico State University. And that I also need to make clear that they, in no way, either one of them are at all responsible for anything that we talk to you about, including all of my privy-related stories. They claim no responsibility for that. So, just to give you a quick overview before we get started of sort of what we mean by rural New Mexico, the people who we were put in touch with or who responded to us and who engaged in these interviews are shown in terms of where they grew up and where their stories are about on this map. So we tried to get as much spread across the state as we possibly could, focusing on areas that are less oftentimes represented in sort of the bigger histories. And so we do have a lot of spread. Many of our interviews today grew up in the area sort of around Albuquerque in the central part of the state. Writ large, I'm including Pecos in that, I'm including Springstead in that, which is a bit far northwest. But so we have these interviews from many different parts of the state. So just to let you know that if you're interested in looking at these interviews, looking at the transcripts and listening to other ones from those areas, we cover a pretty broad range. And so what we're going to do today in terms of talking to you about these interviews and playing the clips, like I said, they cover a lot of material. The interviews were usually at least 2 hours. We've decided to highlight certain themes and play some clips that relate to these themes. And so we're going to be talking about daily life, about language, about health and healing, because it's always fun, about farming and ranching, some little clips on farming and ranching, some things on community life and community celebrations. And then last of all, getting into sort of what your more conventional histories, what are some of the bigger events, but focusing on how oral history can help us understand how people in their everyday lives experienced some of these events that we might be familiar with.
Sure. Okay, so we're going to start with some things about daily life. Can you all hear me? Okay. So as you all, I am sure, know very well, daily life was quite different in New Mexico in the 30s, 40s, and 50s than what we experience today. We already, Kelly and I, when we started this project, we already knew generally that a lot of people didn't have electricity, running water, motorized vehicles, and other things that we would consider now kind of basic necessities and not luxuries. But we were really interested in hearing people's stories about what it was like to live in that world. For us, that's not something that we've ever experienced, so it was really something that we wanted to hear about. And as Kelly said earlier, some of these little details that we hear from people are not the kinds of things that show up in the history books. And this is what we see as really important about doing oral history, is learning these kinds of little details. So we will start with a little clip from the interview with Rick Simpson about a few things about daily life.
All we had was a wood-burning stove, kerosene lamps that we did our homework by, and listened to the radio, Oklahoma City, with a battery-operated radio.
Oklahoma City is where? KOA, Oklahoma.
KOA, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma.
Is everyone able to hear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So we learned about.
just going to say, would you guys perhaps be able to move up a little closer on that side, because that might help.
Okay. So
will you tell us what period?
Sure.
These, that we're talking about, like.
Well, we have reception in the audience, so we can.
Well, that's when I was young. I was back in the 50s and the 60s, raised on my grandfather's ranch. And it was very difficult compared to what today is. People really don't realize it. And
It's from, he was growing up near Torero, New Mexico, in the area of Torero, New Mexico, which is up near Pecos on the Pecos River, and especially focusing on the 50s and 60s. I should also point out, too, because I have photographs here, but sometimes people provided photographs and I use them, and sometimes I just pulled photographs that I already had. So this is from the Pecos River Valley, actually. This is from San Miguel, one of the older homes where I did some work, and it's one of the wood-burning stoves that they had. So the pictures may relate really well to what we're talking about, and sometimes they're just pretty pictures.
Okay, so we also heard lots of stories about tortillas, which are sound really different and way better than the tortillas that I buy in the grocery store today. So we're going to hear a little bit about some tortillas.
The coffee on the wood stove was just extra tasty, and it's just my grandmother would be there making tortillas, and the smell of tortillas in the kitchen was like, that was heaven. Yeah. That was, the smell of that was heaven. And even my mother's tortillas here, because that's what we grew up on, was beans and chili and tortillas. Yeah. So she was constantly cooking tortillas.
So, and that was Lucinda Vigil, who grew up mostly in around Santa Fe, but also was talking there about time that she spent out on a ranch.
El Rancho is the name.
El Rancho. Okay,
So
that's why I forgot.
North of Santa Fe, sort of wider Oaxaca area. And I was just going to add too, because it reminded me, Mr. Baca was talking about his mother's tortillas too, being so thick that you could split them. Which again, I'm hungry. So maybe we shouldn't have started with
Yeah. Okay. So you all already heard a little bit about beans just briefly in that previous clip, but we also heard a lot about how you make good beans, and not from the can, which is how my beans are.
Yeah, so that was our drinking water, and that was also the water that they used to cook beans, because that was the only way. That was the only kind of water you could cook beans with. You couldn't cook beans with no other water because it was too hard, But that water that came from the heavens was the best water for cooking beans and any other food that my mother cooked.
So this is Richard Chavez talking. He grew up in Puerto de Luna, and a number of the people, especially in the East, talked about how you use cistern water versus if you had a well or if you had river irrigation. That the cistern water, especially along the Pecos, has less mineral content than the river water did or other water did. And so he would use the water for the cistern is what his mother would cook with. It's what she would use to wash her hair. It's what she would use for laundry because it was just better, softer water.
And we also heard some other stories about cooking beans from other people, but to try to keep the talk manageable. But we didn't include all of them. But there are many stories about cooking beans on the wood stove all day long, and cooking them with onions and bacon, and just the flavor that you would get from beans. Cooking them that way was much better than, again, from the can. With wild spinach. We did hear a lot about quelites. Yeah, wild spinach.
So shifting over to language, we have a couple clips. So this also came up a lot. This is New Mexico. We have all kinds of ways that language is introduced, both kind of whether you were raised speaking English or raised speaking Spanish, whether you learned English or Spanish as a child or in schools. And those are what we're focusing on. We also heard in interviews that I didn't include as much how many people were learning and getting exposed to also words that were borrowed from neighboring kind of Pueblo groups. And so one of the things I always like to throw out that came up a lot is the use of the term coye in a lot of households to talk about a storage structure like a soterrano, a cellar. Coye is actually a Puebloan word, and yet in the East where I work, it's the one term that comes up. So the first clip I have is from Mr. Baca, talking about initially learning Spanish in the schools in Anton Chico.
Sorry, I forgot I said speak.
As I started my school in Anton Chico, and the teachers over there used to speak Spanish to us all Spanish. I don't know why, but that was where I started school when I was 6 years old in 1934.
So, as you just said, in 1934, going to school in Anton Chico, in the kind of land-grant communities on the Pecos, the teachers spoke Spanish. And then he talks about moving back north and going to school, and there the teachers spoke English. And that's a wider story. Whenever I'm teaching students who've all had to read Les Miltema in schools, and like you're familiar with the story, right, of being raised speaking Spanish and going to school where they only spoke English and having to learn that way. This was an interesting contrast to what we usually hear, that some of the schools in some of these communities, the teachers were still speaking Spanish. And another kind of a little bit different clip comes from Luis Gabaldon, who talks about learning Spanish. So his mother initially raised him in Albuquerque. He was raised as a young child in Albuquerque, and then his parents died, and he went to go live with his grandmother and his grandmother's husband, whose name was Carter, in the area of Irizarry, so kind of Chilili mountain area, that stretch. He went to go live in the mountains, and there everybody spoke Spanish, but he had been raised mostly speaking English.
To learn Spanish, Carter spoke Spanish in a few words in English. And he didn't speak it, he didn't practice it around me. My grandmother spoke Spanish, nothing in English. Ruth spoke English and Spanish, but there was this minister that would come out there, and he bring these little books. One book was the book of Matthew, another one might be the book of another prophet or something. And then he'd take one book and I'd take the other one and read. He'd have me read it in Spanish, or he'd read it in Spanish and I had to follow. And then I'd read it in Spanish and he'd follow and correct me in Spanish. So I started learning Spanish that way. And then with the paper, the New Mexican was written in Spanish back at that time. So he'd get a copy of the New Mexican, and we would go through that. He'd have a copy, and I'd have a copy, and we were reading through that. And next thing you know, I'm reading Spanish, and I'm learning Spanish. That's how I'm learning Spanish.
So he's talking about the area where he's moved in with his grandmother's near Irizarry, and this is in the late 40s, early 1950s. And the bulk of the community and most of his family members either exclusively or primarily spoke Spanish, and so he got help from the priest, basically learning how to speak Spanish. He did say later in his interview that then he went to the public schools where they did only speak English, and then he was helping to tutor all of his cousins and all of the students on English, because that is actually what he'd learned when he was younger. And he was really funny in the interview. He kept saying that like now he couldn't remember words in either language when he was trying to come up with something.
Okay. So we're gonna move away from language a little bit and talk a little bit about health and healing, which is my favorite area to talk about. So the stories about healthcare that we heard from our participants are really focused quite a bit on home remedies. People, it's not that doctors didn't exist. People did say, oh yeah, there was a doctor over in town somewhere, but we never needed him. We had our own way of dealing with illness, so we didn't really need to go to the doctor. Sometimes people went to the doctor to have babies, but not always. So many children were born at home. And Billy Poindexter?
One of the interviewers talked about how after the first few kids, they figured they got it done well enough, they knew what to do, and they just didn't know.
That's right.
Just didn't know.
Right. So he was one of our participants that we focused on in the Las Cruces talks. Who his mom had after the first few, that's no big deal. We don't need the doctor anymore. We got this. So they had the first children with the doctor, and the second kind of half of the kids at home. So those kinds of things happened a lot. And so we heard a lot about different kinds of home remedies, which are things that are interesting to me as an anthropologist, or as a medical anthropologist, but they're also interesting. My father is a family physician. However, I think maybe because he was a family physician, we never went to the doctor. And so most of the remedies that I used growing up were also home remedies, not the same ones. I grew up in rural Arkansas, so they're a little different than what we heard about here, but there are some similarities. So we're going to listen to a few clips from some folks who talked about home remedies and health and healing. So first is Rini Martinez, and she also grew up in the El Rancho area. Is that right? Okay.
I'll never forget, she would get pinto beans, and the pinto beans that were whole beans, there was like half beans. I don't know if you guys are familiar with pinto beans. She would put the pinto beans on her forehead and underneath our eyes to draw the poison out of our headaches and our sore throats or whatever, And she would put like vinegar and the pinto beans with kind of a handkerchief on us. And for sinuses and those kinds of things, and apparently people still do it today, my understanding,
Sure.
Of course, on my grandmother and my dad's side, like I told you, she would use the beans and the potatoes and herbs, different herbs, which I don't remember those herbs, but she would, like put them behind our ear here, and I remember her doing that, and we would laugh, me and my sister would laugh. I said, look at it, Grandma's putting beans on her face. She would plaster it in. Oh, another thing she would use, at that time, she would smoke, and she would have a little, I'll never forget this, the package of cigarettes, they'd have a stamp on them, a little blue stamp. Do you remember that? She'd easily pull off the stamp, and I don't know why, it had to do, whatever it meant, she would put stamps on her forehead too, cigarette stamp. She would save them, she'd lick them, and she'd put them on. And I never had a sore throat last time, but after a little older, I was very prone to sore throats, I had bad sore throat.
She actually goes on to talk about also being told to wear a crystal necklace to cure the sore throat, and then she never got another sore throat after that too.
Yeah. So I had never heard of, I heard about all kinds of things being put on your forehead to use for headaches, but that was the first time I heard about pinto beans. So that was a new one for me. And the cigarette stamps was too. I will say that when I was growing up, my mom used to unwrap her cigarette and take the tobacco out if you got a bee sting, and put the tobacco on the bee sting, and she said that took the sting out. And I thought it did because she told me it did, so I believed her. I don't know if it actually works or not. So, but I had never heard it. Are you all familiar with the cigarette stamp? Using the cigarette stamp? Okay. I just said I had never achieved that. Okay. So this next clip is from Lucinda Mejil. Again, this is from the kind of outside of Santa Fe, El Rancho area. And she is talking about, in this clip, home remedy to deal with fever.
One day I was really sick. I had a really bad fever, and what made me want to study curanderismo in the first place was my grandmother Uriol. She would soak potatoes in vinegar, and she would put the potatoes and vinegar on my hot head. And I looked like this little Indian girl with potatoes on her head at a bench.
This is a story that came up a number of times too. Mr. Baca also talked about that the thin slicing of potatoes soaked in vinegar, sometimes wrapped in like a handkerchief or not, and then rested on the head to draw the fever or to cool the forehead. Which, if you think, especially without refrigeration, that is going to be a pretty effective way to get some evaporative cooling.
Yeah. Yeah, I also hadn't heard about potatoes exactly, but I lived in Mexico for a few years, just like 10 years ago, and I get migraine headaches, and you heard Lucinda mention curanderismo, and so when I was in this community, the family that I lived with, because I was getting these headaches, she sent me to the curandero, who did something similar. He cooked fried basil, kind of dry fried basil, and wrapped it in a cloth soaked in rubbing alcohol, and put it on my forehead to take care of the migraine headache. So there's some similarities there, I think.
Did it work?
Between. Again, he told me it worked, so I believed him. So there's a lot to that, right? It did help. It really did help. I mean, it felt, that because it does feel really cool, and so that definitely helped take some of the intensity out of that headache. Yeah.
I was just going to add for the next clip, because I have a different image for it, but this bottle came from an archaeological site, and it's a bottle of aceite mexicano, and that is one of the things that's mentioned in this clip.
They sold a lot of product called Mexican oil. And it was kind of... Yeah. Yes, a glass bottle, and they used it just about for everything. I mean, if you smashed your hand, well, you just threw up some Mexican oil on it. And if you had a headache, we'll rub that Mexican oil on your forehead. So Mexican oil was one of our big sellers, and tincture of methylate had alcohol in it, burned. They sold a lot of that. It had a glass, not a dropper, a glass stem. You dip it in there and it was red. And you put it on a cut, just burned. I mean, really burned. But if somebody came in with a sore throat, really bad sore throat, my mother would take a pair of foursome-looking things with a cotton ball and soak it in that tincture methylate, had them open their mouth, and just swab around their tonsils. And you talk about a cure. And then the other big seller was mustard plasters. And they were squares about like this, and they were just in paper wrappers. So what you did is take the wrappers off and soak it in hot water, and then put that mustard plaster on their chest, and then they take the other layer of paper off and leave it on there until it dried.
Give some context.
Yeah, I was just going to introduce, and we have many of these people are here with us today, including Mr. Springstead in the back. He's talking about what they sold in the family's trading post. So he grew up in Springstead, New Mexico. It must have made it really easy to spell in classes, which was a trading post about a day's wagon ride outside of Gallup, northeast of Gallup, in New Mexico, just in the checkerboard area, just off the Navajo Reservation. And so his parents ran this, and this is the original structure of the trading post, ran the trading post. And so when he was talking about medicines and remedies, he was also talking about what he remembered the store selling that was in use. And I thought it was fabulous because aceite mexicano is something that I have found in archaeological sites, and I still don't know where they made it. I know, as he says, that it wasn't made in Mexico, but it was widely available seemingly through New Mexico, especially in the early 1900s. And I did have to try to find out what was in it. So I did a little research to try to figure out what this was, and so what I found is that it's made from rhubarb, anise, cardamom, cayenne, and peppermint oil. So I don't know if that's the standard recipe, but that's the one I was able to find. Does that seem like that might be at least in the ballpark?
What was the third thing? Is it rhubarb, cardamom, and
anise? Or anise? That's how you say it, anise. Okay. And cayenne and peppermint oil.
Just sounds powerful. I also have to say, just from my perspective up here, it was wonderful watching the description of the cotton swab with the tincture, with all of your faces were like, it does sound very painful.
However, I have to say that, so I recently have been doing a lot of work in looking at medicine as it's practiced today. We still do stuff like that. It's not that in doctors' offices, they still torture you. It still happens.
Yes, I can verify that. So switching to a couple stories about farming and ranching, obviously this was the theme that came up in a lot of the interviews that are focused on rural New Mexico, and so this is a very small sample of stories that we pulled that were people's experiences growing up where you were spending a lot of time often either dealing with sheep or cattle or goats or all of the above, and then also in many cases having to plant and go back and harvest. This first story is from Rick Simpson and family, talking about remembering his grandfather telling him how he could find the cattle when you had to go back out to find them in a few weeks, how you would actually know where they had traveled to.
We used to go up and get the cattle from the grazing permit, and he used to always tell us that. I always wondered. He always said, which way were the cows looking when you left? Last time you saw them up north. And we'd tell him, I'd tell him, okay, they were facing north. Said, okay, so north of there is a Clay Basin. We're rolling and I went down the canyon. It took us hours to get out of there with the horses, you know. So next time we go up that way, about a week or two later to go check the cattle. And you can't get people over there grazing. He'd ask us, okay, which way were they facing?
Hopefully it always works. It's pretty amazing.
It was amazing.
That worked? It makes sense. It does make sense. Over a few weeks, it's pretty impressive. So one of the other things that came up a lot, particularly with kids growing up on these ranches or doing a lot of farming, is how often that was a big part of what they had to do, right? Part of the chores, not only every day coming home, going to fetch the cattle or going to monitor the sheep, but also there are times of year, if you're primarily a farmer or herder, where you have to focus on the crops and you have to focus on the animals, and nobody cares that you maybe also have school. And so this is Mr. Baca talking about missing school twice a year, that because of having to have to help with the sheep and having to help with the farm.
Yeah, we never completed the full term of school because they always took us out of school a month before it ended, spring or in May. They always took us out in April, and then we wouldn't get back until October. So we always missed May and September because that was a time that we were doing all the harvest and the cattle and everything that we had to do. And in April, it's in May is when all the lambs are born, And that's when they took us out because we used to have to go out there and herd sheep for them. They used to separate them and depending on when they were born, they can't keep them too long with an older lamb and a smaller younger one, so we separate them, make a little flock over here and over there and over there, and each one has to have to take care of them, So that was the deal for missing school in May and not coming back until October because September was a harvest time.
So, just in case you missed any of that, he was always getting pulled out of school in May for lambing season, and then to monitor the herds over the summer. And then come fall, his father ran a ranch, but they also had a farm in Cienega. The ranch was in Galisteo. This is in the 30s and 40s primarily. And so he was regularly having to not only move between the family, but they were constantly, especially the older children, especially the older boy children, were being pulled out of school to help with the sheep and to help with the harvest. And so oftentimes you didn't kind of go all the way through the school system, or you didn't experience a complete year of school until much later, sometimes not ever. And that's something that came up in a number of the presentations, or in a number of the interviews. So one of the other interviews that we did focused actually on similar activities, on having to learn to work with animals, but in this case it's at a school here in Albuquerque. It's the McCurdy School here in Albuquerque. And so this is by David Duran. He grew up in Dixon, New Mexico, but his family were always attended the Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Mission schools, because in Dixon your schools were either the Catholic mission or the Presbyterian mission. And then once they finished the school there, they actually went on, he continued on to school here at McCurdy, which was run by the Presbyterian Church here in Albuquerque, and it included a number of sort of activities beyond your reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Occasionally we'd have a calf birth, and if we were around or available to do that, we would help with that. So we would learn from that. We also had, when we had new piglets, there was a time when you had to castrate them, so we learned how to do that. We didn't use a vet or anything like that. So there's quite a bit that came with your school. so on your certificate it says knows how to castrate. There were orchards.
Okay.
I remember in the summertime, the springtime, spraying the trees with no protective gear, so you get soaking wet and the stuff that you're spraying the trees with. We had gardens where we would have to irrigate, hoe the weeds, all that stuff, make sure that the plants are doing well. We would lease land from the Indians in San Juan to grow corn for silage for the cows. We'd be out there all day in that hot sun.
So just to be clear, so this is the McCurdy School, and it is both a school but also a boarding school with an operating ranch and farm. And so partly what you were learning to do is be a responsible person in many different ways. So not just learning school lessons, but also helping out with everything that needs to happen on the farm and on the ranch.
Okay, so we also have a couple of stories that we really wanted to tell that are kind of more broadly about community life. This is I think community life is maybe a very broad category, but these are just really fun stories. And again, these are the kinds of things that you might not hear about if you're just reading the history books and you're not talking to people who were living during that time and remembering these things that they did on a regular basis. So we'll hear from Luis Gabaldon about rodeos.
There was a rodeo normally on a Saturday afternoon, and after the rodeo, then the dance, and then after the dance, it was a gang fight. Because there was all these villages, Cabosa, Chile, Tijeras, and Moriarty. All these villages would all fight each other. And up in Chile, you could see the rocks flying like it was hail.
You made sure to clarify that they always waited until after the rodeo and after the dance before the fight started. You had to do the dance first.
Okay, so we also heard from Lucille Wolf about rattlesnake races, or maybe the attempt to have rattlesnake races, which was a little frightening to me.
The son, Carlsbad, had a rattlesnake race. And the son collected rattlesnakes, put them in a barrel, and put a piece of tin over them to take to Carlsbad for the rattlesnake races. Well, in the middle of the night, one night, with all those rattlesnakes in that barrel, the dogs heard the rattlesnakes rattling and pushed over the bill, and the tin fell off, and we had rattlesnakes all over the neighborhood. And my mother who was very small. She was 5'4", and very small. Started out the back door where there was a cement step down to the sidewalk, going up to the barnyard where we had chickens and had cows and so forth. We also had a washroom out there to do the laundry. And this big rattlesnake was sunning itself, laid it across, and she jumped over it and ran, got the shovel to kill the rattlesnake, and she was just cursing a mile a minute.
I should add too, this is Lucille Wolf, who grew up, she lives in Albuquerque, but grew up in the area of Artesia in Hopen and in Tonga, especially in the 1930s. And so, having worked on the Pecos myself and having to protect the students from the rattlesnakes, the idea of collecting them and sticking them in a barrel horrified me, as I think you maybe could hear. It's not on my list of things to do. Killing them with the shovel, on the other hand, I have done.
So the last thing we wanted to do in terms of some major things we wanted to go over is to reflect on, we've been talking about a lot of aspects of daily life, what it was like to be ranching and farming, about what it was like to try to treat home remedies, what community life was like, schooling, language, home heat, and kerosene lamps for homework. But we also wanted to show how these oral history interviews can be really valuable, even if what we're talking about is sort of history that everybody knows. So, we know some basic things about World War II, we know some basic things about Vietnam, but it's still really different to hear people's memories about their experiences of those times. So the first one we have here is a clip by Bronson Springstead talking about growing up in New Mexico during World War II when you had to have these kind of ration cards and coupons to purchase a number of items.
It was wartime. Things got pretty scarce. I mean, we were getting stamps for the government. I even found an issued green sugar stamp for me, because even the kids got, you had to have these stamps to buy sugar, to buy certain items, not canned goods, but sugar, flour, baking powder, that kind of stuff.
So I want to say two things before I go on to the next one. One is just to explain, this picture is not from that, but when I was trying to find a picture, I went through some of my mother's family history stuff. And this is a coupon book, a ration card that was actually issued to my mother, who was an infant at the time, and they still went through most of the sugar. I was told that was always the one that went first because they had young children in the house, and so sugar was very important. I also wanted to mention one of the clips that we had came from Mrs. Saunders, who's also here, that we showed in the Las Cruces public talk that was talking about ration cards, and she was talking about her mother. Her father got called up and had to travel to the military base, and her mother actually pooled gas cards, coupon cards, with another woman, and they loaded up all of the children in a vehicle, pooled their gas cards so that they could both drive to actually see their husbands before they deployed. So having to keep track of sugar, of baking powder, but also fuel was really important. We'll try to talk over the dance class as best we can. I feel like that's a sign. We'll move it along. Yeah. We have So the next interview clip that we have was also from Lucille Wolf, again, out kind of near Artesia, New Mexico, but talking about a prisoner of war camp. I have an unrelated image also from my mother's family history collection. Oftentimes, from my perspective in New Mexico, when we talk about camps during World War II, it's oftentimes about the Japanese internment camps, because there actually were a number of them that weren't that well studied, but particularly in Santa Fe, that one has had some public television specials, and so people remember the internment camps. Something I was less familiar with until I lived in Las Cruces is that we also had a number of POW camps in New Mexico of Italians and Germans especially, who were then oftentimes brought in to do work on the farms that were producing food for the war effort.
They had a prisoner of war camp in Hagen, which was outside of Artesia, not far. And they trucked those prisoners in open trucks that had the big sides on them, you know, to the different fields where the farmers needed help. Because, of course, during the war, they didn't have any help. So the prisoners were put to work. The prisoners said they lived better than they did in Germany because they had little refrigerators and radios in the prisoners' quarters. And they got fed, and when they'd be working and picking the cotton and harvesting the crops down, and they'd sometimes stop there at the store and they'd get cold drinks for all of the prisoners that had been working out in the field. And they'd stop at the store and they'd get cold drinks for all the prisoners because they had to drive on to Artesia, past Artesia to Hagen.
So she also, later in the interview, talks about, that's, again, Lucille Wolf talking about the Artesia area. Her dad had a store, so they would stop these kind of open trucks that would be transporting the POWs to go work in the farm field, would sometimes stop and get them cold drinks. And she talks about later, kind of post-World War II, her husband was in the military, he was a meteorologist, and they were based in Germany and for a period of time, and she actually encountered somebody who had stopped at her dad's store when he was a prisoner of war, and remembered the store and getting the cold drinks. So, I know, it's wild. So one other story is shifting forward, but talking about Vietnam, and particularly about the Vietnam draft, and the way that it was experienced by David Durant. Oh, okay.
They drafted so many people in August of 1969 because the draft was going to end. They were going to go to the lottery where they pick ping pong balls and numbers on them and associate that with a name. There were so many people drafted that wasn't enough room for them at Fort Bliss. They were sleeping on the floor of the halls. And there were so many kids there that couldn't even speak English. A lot of Hawaiians were not literate in English that they had drafted. A lot of kids from Puerto Rico who could only speak Spanish were there with us. It was a huge draft. I imagine most boot camps in the country were full of people. The military thought that was the end of their ability to get people into the service.
So, and I'll just, this was interesting to me. You know, some of the stories that we were hearing as we interviewed people, you know, were from times that, you know, I would hear maybe about from my grandparents a little bit, but then we started to also hear stories, you know, that my dad, you know, used to talk about. So my dad also talked a little bit about Vietnam. I think he's probably about the same age as Mr. Durant, but when they started doing the ping pong balls, he was number 10, and so he was going right to Vietnam, and so he immediately got enrolled in medical school and didn't end up having to go to Vietnam. But later on, he and I went, when I was probably 12 years old, we went to Washington, D.C. to the Vietnam War Memorial, and he found the names of his friends who had gone. And that was I mean, he just, you know, knelt down and burst into tears about that, you know, seeing the names of his friends who had gone. and he had been able to we that. And I can't imagine what that was really felt like for him internally, even though I saw that expression of that, you know, when we were there. It was the first time I saw my dad cry, actually. So those stories really resonate, I think, in a lot of ways for a lot of people in many different ways.
I was going to ask if you could also tell the story about when he came back. I think we have time.
Oh, sure. Okay, or maybe, well, Mr. Duran is here. The other story that we heard from Mr. Duran about returning from Vietnam is that, and I don't know if you want to tell this story, but it was a very different return than a lot of people, a lot of soldiers who fought in Vietnam had. I don't know if you want to tell that story, or do you want me to tell it?
I can try.
Okay.
By the way, I've got good news. You don't have to go to the trading post for Mexican oil. You get it on eBay. It's in a yellow oil. That's me on the right, in case you were wondering. The kid on the left that we used to call Newbie, I don't remember his name. He was one of the really young kids. I think he was maybe 17 or 18 years old there. I had already been through college. I was quite a bit older than him, and I had started a career in the newspaper business. I was a reporter for the afternoon paper here in Albuquerque, the Tribune. When I got drafted, I spent a year at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and then I came down on levy to Vietnam and went there to Vietnam. My oldest daughter was born about a month after I landed over there, but before Christmas in 1970. And I got to leave in the end of August of 71. Leaving was, I don't know how to describe this. I was on a little fire base way up in the northern part of the country, up by the demilitarized zone. That was where I spent my 9 or 10 months. It was a base that supported artillery fire. We had firing batteries along the DMZ and also out towards Laos. So we weren't a very big group, pretty small. When it came time to leave, you had to find your way back to Cameron Bay, which was a long ways on, way south, in order to come home. So you hitchhike and get on whatever airplanes were available to get back to Cameron Bay so you could end up going home. What's interesting about that period of time was there was a lot of anger, you know, all over, not outside of the military and inside of the military, about the whole Vietnam experience. When I left my fire base with another kid, young man, it took us, I think, 2 or 3 days to get down to Cameron Bay. He got to leave a day before I did. And when we went down there, you had to kind of stay awake 24 hours a day because they had formations. You had to show up every so many hours and hopefully wait for your name to be called out. And then once your name was called out, they'd hand you a package of paperwork and stuff to fill out and everything. And then you would give it like an airplane ticket to get on an airplane to go home. Flew to Guam, coming home. Flew to Hawaii, middle of the night. Airplane, they made us get off the airplane in Hawaii because it wouldn't restart. It's like 2 in the morning or something, and so the only place that was open was the cantina at the bar at the airport. So the whole airplane load of GIs are in this little bar in there. And then Fort Lewis, Washington was where we actually went to Vietnam from and came home from. Took about a day and a half to get processed out, including your clothes and everything. I got on a bus, went to SeaTac, Seattle Tacoma Airport, and took my little airplane voucher to Continental Airlines. They put me on an airplane to Denver. I got to Denver, and went to check in get off one airplane, go to another gate to check in, and they said they would call me. So I went walking around and stopped at the book shelf somewhere, looking at stuff, and I apparently fell asleep on my feet because this other person came by and tapped me on the shoulder and said, are you Specialist Duran? And I said, yes, because my name was on my shirt. And he said, you're being called to the gate. So I went to the gate, it was in the afternoon, and they said, I'm sorry, Mr. Duran, but this flight we wanted to put you on this afternoon is full. Meantime, my wife's waiting here in New Mexico to go pick me up in Albuquerque. And so we'll have to, in order to make sure we get on the next flight, which is like 7 o'clock at night, it's the flight from Denver to Albuquerque to El Paso. We can make sure you get a ticket on it for another $30. So I reached in my pocket and gave him $30, was about all I had. And so I waited till that. I finally got hold of my wife and said, I'm going to be on the next plane. So I went to get on the plane at 7 o'clock and there was hardly anybody on it. That really made me feel awful. So I couldn't help but feel like, you know, this whole attitude about the war was just permeated everything, you know, including how you were treated by the people who weren't even involved in it. So I finally got home and I forgot it. I mean, I didn't want to remember that experience at all. I just kind of felt like it was too bad. Well, fortunately, I started work this was like on a Tuesday or so, and you lose track of time, you know, war zone, you know, you don't know what day of the week it is, because you're working all the time. So I called the office and asked them if I could come back to work, and they said, fine, can you start on Monday, which was kind of early. I should have waited longer because everything's different, you know. I weighed about 120 pounds. As you can see, I'm pretty thin there. Somebody saw that picture in my house and said, well, who's the typist? And they would have the glasses. Wearing a flak jacket for crying out loud. I got some business things taken care of. My wife was in Espanilla with her parents and got to spend a few days with my little baby girl. And before I started work at the newspaper, went to the paper. We were an afternoon paper. I got there about 7 o'clock in the morning, and everybody's super busy. So they put me to work with a young man who did the police beat to keep me out of the office, I found out that day. So I went over to the police station, and I worked with him all day long on the police stuff. Then he kept calling at the end of the day to see if it was okay to go back in. I'm wondering, what's going on? So we go back to the office, and this guy by the name of Ralph got me out of the parking lot. He says, I've got the fire beat. Fire station number 1 is across the street. He says, let me take you over there and show you around in case you get that job. Well, went over there, and it was ridiculous. He was showing me things that, you know, didn't mean anything, but all he was doing was stalling. So finally he gets a phone call at the station and he says, okay, we can go to the office now. So I went over there and had this huge welcome for me at the paper. Mariachis, you know, great hors d'oeuvres and that type of thing. My wife was there with the baby, and my folks and my in-laws were there. It was just a beautiful experience. They made a newspaper front page for me. Said, welcome home, Dave. There were 2 other guys working at the paper who also had served over there as well. So it was, you know, from a bitter experience to a beautiful experience. It was really nice. So that's what happened to me.
Thank you for telling that story. And I think these are the kinds of things that you don't get to hear about unless you really talk to people and spend time learning what folks' experiences really were instead of just reading about it in a book.
So we have it's not a blooper reel. We have a few more clips at the end. We wanted to make sure though that we didn't test people's, backside's level of comfort with the chairs. And so we tried to keep it relatively short, but we do have some additional clips. But what I'd like to do right now is just wrap it up, especially for people who need to go. The last thing we wanted to do is have the option to have people talk. So before I get to that, I did want to say, and I realize I'm asking you to, I guess, loosen your backside very quickly. If you participated in an interview, would you please stand up?
As I ask people whose hips are struggling as much as mine.
So thank you all so much.
I just wanted to make sure, some of you we pulled up, some of you we've asked to talk. Thank you again. I just wanted to make sure
to acknowledge all of you who came to listen, the family members who showed up, the people from the community who learned about it, and thank you for coming and getting to listen to some of these stories. It is a gift to us that we got to hear them. And it is a gift to our communities and to our state that we get to actually save these recordings and when the transcripts are completed, the transcripts as well, and have those be things that anybody can go listen to and anybody can go read, because these are some of the highlights, but there are incredible stories in every single one of these, and a lot of really funny stories, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. But there's some really incredible stories, and I do encourage you to keep current with the project. I also encourage you as well, the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, the reason we're working with them, other than that they're 15 minutes down the road from us, is they do have an oral history program. And they have on their website information for not only how to access that and to search through abstracts of other interviews that have been done, but they also have a lot of resources. They're the people I went to get ideas about what kinds of release forms we might want, what kinds of questions they've had good experiences answering. They have a ridiculous binder of all of the place names in New Mexico so that when they're producing the transcripts, they can make sure that they've picked the right one and that they're spelling it correctly. It is a wonderful thing to do these oral histories. You don't have to turn them over to a museum. You can do them on your cell phone if you don't have a voice recorder, but I wanted people to recognize that this is a really wonderful thing to be able to do. There's a lot of wonderful stories out there, and to encourage you, if you have the interest and the time, to do some of these on your own, and that if you need help in thinking through, you are absolutely welcome to contact us. And also the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum has a lot of resources to help guide this, including some sample questions. I can say that I definitely went back and interviewed my parents with the same interviews, just because after doing so many of these interviews, I really wanted to know some of these things that I'd never thought to ask them, and was quite surprised actually in the kinds of things that I was learning. My dad had some very similar stories. My dad's Australian. And was raised mostly in the 50s and 60s, so listened to a lot of our interviews. But he grew up near the edge of the largest gum tree forest, and so they were hunting rabbits for food, and they didn't have any plumbing or electricity in his grandmother's house, and so there were some remarkably similar stories. And I know that all of our research assistants too also went back and were calling their grandparents and things. It's a wonderful opportunity that we have, and there's never been a time where it's easier to do. Very few people don't have access to somebody with a cell phone at sort of the least case that can record these stories, and really do appreciate it afterwards. We've definitely been in a position of having some people who've become, since the interview, have suffered some bad health. And in fact, one person who we wanted to interview that we weren't able to because he passed away before we could. And you never realize how much you want to have those stories until you can't get them anymore. So with that in mind, we just wanted to see if there were stories. We had to have the castor oil bottle here. Castor oil came up a lot. If anybody had stories that they wanted to share, things that they were reminded of in listening to these that they wanted to share.
Can I tell the one about rodeo?
Yes, that's a great story.
she mentioned that my mom pooled gas coupons to get to Fort Sill in Oklahoma to be with my dad. And his degree was in agriculture. So because that was considered essential to the war effort, he was discharged after officer's training and went to work for a cooperative extension service as a county agent in Torrance County. And every July 4th, there was a rodeo. Now, in Torrance County, the rodeo wasn't that big. It was just a, barbed wire fence. But it had some very lively brand bulls for the bull riding. And one 4th of July, this one particular frame of bull was kind of testy. And the cars were lined up around the barbed wire fence so that, you could get as close as possible to watch the action. And I say this one frame of bull was kind of testy, and he threw his rider and headed straight for our pickup. My mom was sitting on the hood of the truck. And he jumped the fence, and my dad grabbed her just off of the hood of the pickup just before the bull hit. So that was what our rodeos were like in Torrance County in the 40s.
My name is Bronson Springstead, and this little tale that this young lady told reminds me that almost any gathering that we had back in the late 30s and early 40s, if it was a rodeo situation, they would have a stand that sold like a hamburger stand, only it was Spam. So you could get a Spam sandwich, and that was just the way things were at that time. And that was a big seller. Spam's pretty old. We were selling it as a trading post way back, and so it's been long standing, and they still sell it.
How much did it cost back in the 30s and 40s?
I can't really recall because between Spam, corned beef, and corned mutton, those were some of the best-selling meats in the trading post. The Spam was a little bit higher though than corned beef and corned mutton by probably a dime or something like that. But I would say probably then it was like 35 cents a can. And the other thing I'd go back to is those stamps. You also had to have those stamps to buy tires. Not only gas, but tires, and it was just for the necessary things. Like she said, it was for sugar, flour, staples. You couldn't use those stamps on anything else. You couldn't buy liquor with them, you couldn't buy cigarettes, you couldn't buy anything but tires. You had to have an awful lot of them to buy tires. Thank you.
I've got a question, not
Sure,
a
your
comment.
questions are great too.
And for you particularly because you do medical anthropology. I keep hearing about how in New Mexico, and I'm sure other places, but in New Mexico, folk medicine and the curanderas and those types of things are dying out. That tradition is dying out. My question to you is, what are people like you doing to document what's happening? Because I'm sure in families that's still going on, but you don't go to a curandera because there just aren't.
Sure.
And how that's being documented for the future.
Sure. No, that's a great question. Yeah.
What are these related beats? It's in the end, but it comes down to there must be curses.
So there is a school, and maybe it's here in Albuquerque. I'm who are interested in learning Curanismo. That's part of trying to revive some of those traditions and practices that are often disappearing from small communities. But also, I haven't done this personally, but I have a student who I'm hoping is going to be doing some of this work, is doing interviews specifically with curanderos who are still around, and maybe even if they're not practicing anymore, but they have memories of their practice as curanderos, to do interviews with them, kind of like these oral history interviews, to learn a lot more about that practice. One of the things that sometimes is difficult about that is that some people don't really want to share those, and especially the more kind of spiritual practices that are involved in curanderismo, because they're not really for the general public, right? They're to be passed down to the next person who's going to be practicing medicine. So there are some challenges like that, but there is a school. There are young people who are interested in learning those practices and are becoming curanderos and curanderas. So I think there's a little bit of a revitalization of those practices that's happening now. But that's kind of what I know, and hopefully the student, one of our students who's interested in curanderismo, Kayla, who might be doing something on that too.
I was going to say, one of the students who some of you met because she came for some of my interviews, especially in the north, you met her, is Kayla Archuleta Brown, and she loved those questions because a lot of these were things her grandmother was a curandera, and so a lot of these were things she remembered. And she's also planning, she's been an undergraduate with us, she's starting a master's program in the fall, and she's interested in curanderismo, and so that's actually one of the things that she wanted to do for her research.
I like to tell a little story about my experience. When I went into the service, I had my basic training in Fort Bliss. Oh, by the way, I'm Felipe Baca. That's the first thing I should have said. And when I finished my, my basic training, they told us that we were going to Europe. So they sent us home on a delay route basis. We were to come home for 10 days and then get on the train and get to Cancun, New Jersey. From there, they bussed us to New York and put a little ship to go across. And we were all so happy because we were going to Europe, Everybody that had come back from there or from the South Pacific, they always told us, try to go to Europe, don't go to the South Pacific. And so we were all very happy. Anyway, we got on the ship and we started out, and the ship kept going farther and farther south. Before we knew it, we were going through Panama Canal. And we went across and headed west. Well, we ended up in Hawaii for a few days, well, a couple of months. And then from there, they sent us to Korea. And when we got to Korea, there was 2.5 feet of snow on the ground. And it wasn't cold. Okay, it was cold. So they sent us into this brand new processing center that they had just finished with this metal quonset hots, with this little coal also on one end and metal at the other. Well, the people that were around it were okay, but the rest of us froze to death, just about froze to death. So, nevertheless, we ended up in Korea instead of going to Europe, where we thought we were going. One other story that I'd like to tell you. I could tell you stories all day. This time I'll cut it short. No, I talked about Chico, where I went to start school. And the teachers spoke Spanish to us at the time. Anyway, my son Mike, who's here, is an avid golfer. So one day he showed up and Sunday I went to play golf. And he was all by himself. They put him and said, well, there's a group of 3 people over there. You can join them, go play with them. Well, he went over there and turned out that they were all Bacchus also. Well, he introduced himself and told him his name. A little while later, my cousin Jimmy,
asked him, you said you were a Paca, but I bet you're not a Paca from Antochico. And I said, well, my grandfather was born in Antochico. So he said, well, who's your grandfather? He says, Pascual. Well, Pascual is my uncle. He said, brother to my dad. And it was my cousin Jimmy and his son and his nephew. So they all four Pacas got together. They never met. And besides that point, I want to thank you ladies for putting this presentation on and giving us an opportunity to express our experiences as we were growing up. And I think I say this in behalf of all the people that are here that went through that era. You know, everything sounds so familiar, you know, when they bring it up, because I went through it. Thank you so very much.
What we have in the sort of extra reels, but came from Mr. Baca talking about neighbors and sort of post-depression, a lot of people not using banks or feeling comfortable using banks, and this is something that came up in a variety of capacities. Mr. Springs said stories from the trading post where you didn't have banks, right, and so everything was on exchange or pawn, but he tells the story about his dad going to ask a neighbor for some cash to loan one of his workers, and the guy says yes, and then just keeps chatting with him and keeps chatting with him again, and it isn't getting the money, and so he finally figures, all right, so maybe he's not actually going to give it to me, and goes to leave, and the guy comes running after him with the silver dollars, right? It was 5 silver dollars, and they were all blackened because he probably kept them under his floorboards and didn't want to get them while his father was there in the house with him. I love. Was there? Go ahead.
I got one thing to say. Now I'm getting my senses back together. This gets to be emotional. But I remember my grandfather was great big old buckets of lard, the 5-gallon buckets of lard. My grandmother and grandfather used to put their money in those and hide them. And we used to play, yeah. And we used to play with them when we were kids and stuff like that. My grandfather went upstairs and caught my sister Shirley, and you know, in one of the buckets, she jumped out the second-story window of the ranch house. You know, it was just a small little ranch house, which was built by my great-grandfather, and all his kids were born in there. And then his kid, Cristino Rivera was the home settler, and then Encarnacion was my grandfather, and everybody was born in that house. And then we were all raised in there, above Trero, and during the mining time. And the way these ladies have presented this, I think it would be a good idea if a lot of us keep in contact with them, especially to have homesteaders up over here to see what our forefathers went through to protect this country, and see that it was hard work. You want to get ahead, all you have to do is work. That's my favorite word, work. Just work. And I'm going to have some t-shirts made up. I'll be passing them around. But, yeah, and we used to play with them and everything. My grandfather would say, you know, got un poquito nomás, hombre. You know, and we'd go and, God, I wish I had those doggone things now. But you know what? Nobody ever, when he passed away, everybody came in like a bunch of aspirantes, you know. Aspirantes, and just cleaned out everything. We even had comic books after he passed away. Well, I had one aunt that came in and burned all our comic books. I mean, they were from Archie to Superman, Donald Duck, all of those. And she said the reason that she burned them is because they had cactus on them. Well, we had certain ones that were on the top that always stayed, so that the rest of them wouldn't get wet and run, you know? Boy, but that teed off so much and stuff like that. And the way that I was raised up there, you know, we got water from the river. Muscusal was up on the hillside. You know, we killed our own beef, lamb, pork, everything. We didn't go to the store to buy it. Very, very little. And then the vegetables, you know, and then all the wild plants that you could eat. Eating calites with bacon was one of my favorite ones, man. And then, like they said, the meaty tortillas. Those things were meaty tortillas, not latones, you know, not tin, you know. And that's why I love it. My wife makes them sometimes, but I clean her out pretty quick on them. So she doesn't make me very many. But it was a time, and it makes me go back and see what our forefathers went through. And people got to remember to think. that freedom isn't free. You gotta fight for it. And if we don't, we're gonna be like the Jews and other people. We have such liberties here. My wife is from Mexico. She came across legally and stuff. You know, we encourage people to come over, do it legally and stuff like that. Sure, this is what this country's based on. You know, immigrants and stuff, you know? But just come in, what is Australia, you gotta have a job before you go there? And stuff like that. Why don't they make it like that here? Or else, you know, not this invasion and stuff, but you know, I don't blame people doing what they want to do. But then too, the men, you know, our forefathers, they fought, they died. And I think with all the young men that come over here and stuff, in their country, they should band together and fight together. You know? And stay there and fight for what they believe in. You could, like I wrote Secretary of State Maggie, I keep calling her Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, you know. I didn't have to shed any of my blood anywhere because I was in the Coast Guard, but we did chase after Jack junks and monitor Russian submarines and stuff like that along the coast of Alaska, through up to Point Barrow and all over, and chase Japanese junks, you know, they're in the Aleutian Islands, and I mean during bad storms. One time we went and we were after 2 fishing boats. We caught one of them, and I was on a scientific ship, supposedly. They never did tell you everything they were supposed to know, you know. And but it was scary times when they said, you know, manned battle stations and stuff like that. And that's when I realized, I said, you know, like, God, now I see what these poor guys went through. Like my grandfather, you know, my brother from Vietnam being all messed up and everything. And, you know, freedom is free, and if we don't watch it, we're going to lose it. And like I told Maggie Toulouse, you know, I didn't have to shed any blood anywhere or anything, and I hope I don't have to do it, protecting my gun rights here in the United States, because I will do it. And that's not a threat or anything, that's just my own reason and stuff like that. Because once they take our arms from us, you know, the gun doesn't kill by itself. It's the person. Evaluate the people. Evaluate the politicians first. That's all I can say.
Yes.
I want to thank you for working on this project. I think it's a very important thing to do. I got kind of involved in college in the vocal class and recording things like music and superstitions and that type of thing, which eventually went into the school archives. But I want to thank you for the good work and ask you, where does it go from here? Is it got more life to it?
Yes.
More work associated with it?
Yes, so a couple of things. One is that all of the audio will be at the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum, and the transcripts will eventually be online. But the other part of this project that we're really interested in, and I'd love to know what you all think about this, is that we wanted to, you know, we're doing these public talks, and I think that, you know, that's great, but that's one time, right? And then we're done. And so what we were interested in is potentially doing a podcast series where we use some of the clips that we've used in these public talks, but it will also give us the opportunity to use some additional stories that we didn't have time to include in these public talks, and make those available so that people can listen to them. And then we can also maybe we could bring some of you, come back and visit some of you and talk with you a little bit more, get some more context. And then it will also give us an opportunity in the podcast to kind of give a little bit more context to all of the stories as a whole. So that's one plan that we have. I can't speak for Kelly. We have multiple projects, but I love doing this project. Actually, the first oral history project that I did was with my grandfather, and I didn't even know it was called oral history. When I did it, I lived with my granddad, actually for a lot of the time when I was growing up, but particularly when he was in his 90s after my grandma passed away. I went and lived with him so that he could stay in his house. And so I remembered all these stories that he would tell me all the time growing up, and I just thought, you know, I want to be able to keep hearing these. And so we spent a lot of time recording a lot of his stories and songs that he would sing. And so I have those, and they're really special to me and really important. And I also now play them for my nieces and nephews who never got to meet him, and they know him, through these recordings that we did, which I think is really important. So I'm really interested in just continuing to do this. Talk with more people, maybe talk with you all again. If there are things that you remember at this point that you didn't get to tell us the first time. It is time consuming, right? Because we travel all over the place to do these, but I'm really interested in figuring out a way to continue to do this project too, and continue to get new stories from people. I also am really interested in, I'm hoping we're going to maybe get to do this with one class in Santa Fe at some point. Is talking to, and I've done it actually in Las Cruces in a couple of high school classes, is talking with young people about my experience doing these oral histories, and really encouraging and teaching young people about how to do oral history so that they can do these kinds of interviews with their family members as well. So I hope that that's another way that we can continue the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I'm doing that with my mom now. I go to Mexico once a year, things and I record. And my problem is that I know there's things that she doesn't want to talk about. Right. So how do I get it to? I don't know.
Yeah, some screws. Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes, at least my approach to it is if there are things that people don't want to talk about, then I don't record them. Yeah. But a lot of times, like with my granddad, he was in World War II, and he was really hesitant to talk about his experience in World War II at first. But as we continued to talk, he got a little bit more comfortable telling more stories about World War II. He experienced a lot of loss during that time. In fact, his first wife, who's not my grandma, but his first wife actually was killed in a car accident while he was overseas, and he had a young daughter, and so there were a lot of things he was trying to figure out around that time that were really emotional and difficult for him to talk about. But once we started talking a lot, he started to get more and more comfortable telling the stories. So sometimes it just takes some time.
It helps.
Yeah.
I think that's healing. For him has been really healing his soul. It's great too.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to add as well too, one of the things, and I wish we had had the kind of easy access to recorders. I was always really interested in family history. That's where some of that stuff comes from, is my grandparents and great-grandparents' items, and I asked them a lot of questions, and I have some written stories from them, but I never had this technology, or I wasn't able to do the recording that I can down do with my parents. And the thing is, we have a lot of relatively inexpensive and easy access to a lot of things, and so and people are oftentimes comfortable with different kinds of equipment. So some people are totally comfortable being videotaped. I'm not one of those people, ironically. This is for our evaluators. You've got cameras here. But some people are more comfortable with audio, especially when it's something like a phone that you can put down so that people don't have to think about it. They become less aware of it. And some people are going to be more comfortable with just talking and not being recorded. It's harder to do interviews that way. You want to be able to take notes, which is hard to do while listening. So sometimes, for those of you who participated in interviews with us, we always had at least one other person with us for exactly that reason. So somebody could be making sure, taking notes, making sure we'd ask the questions, and then one of us could just be having a conversation, because it's really hard to kind of get stories when you're not able to look and listen and follow along, and to do that and take notes at the same time is hard. So it's helpful if you can have another person there that's kind of helping you take notes. But that's a useful thing to be able to do, is sort of figure out what people's comfort level is. So maybe she's not comfortable being recorded on a certain thing, but she might talk about it if she wasn't being recorded, and then you can take notes on that. Because that is oftentimes the thing, is figuring out people's comfort level. One thing I didn't mention, but that is something that gets brought up a lot too, is that StoryCorps also, you can find information about them online. It's an organization that facilitates especially kind of recording stories. I think you can actually rent equipment from them too, that are interviews, a conversation between two people that gets recorded. They have a lot of resources as well to think about, like how you might do it, and how you can get equipment, and whether you can actually have that story. Like they accept basically stories that people are willing to record and then make part of a national archive. And so they have a lot of information as well that's intended for anybody who's had no experience of working with any of this equipment or doing any of this before. It makes it really accessible and really easy to work with.
We hope that you all, we're easy to find. We're at New Mexico State University in the anthropology department, so it's easy to get in touch with us. And we really would love to hear from you all if you have other ideas about where to go from here or what we might do with these interviews that we've done. We'd love to hear them.
I would say one thing is get it to the children. I don't know how the parents would feel, but see from the start when our forefathers, defeated the British and stuff like that, through the Civil War, so hard, the hard times. My grandfather used to tell me about when he was little, his father, Cristino Rivera, would tell him about the Indians, because he was real friendly with the Indians. They would trade meat and milk. My great-grandfather would have cattle, and they would bring him milk, and they would make a trade. But he said in the winter times, you'd see him across the ladera, along the cliffs, where Indians starving and stuff like that, to where they'd be comitando and eating the food back up and stuff like that, because they were starving. And a lot of people don't realize this, and like the little march that they had from someplace here, next to Yellow or whatever, down towards, I don't know what that one was. Very few people know about that.
Navajo?
Yeah.
Long walk down to Bosque Redondo.
Yeah, that, And I think that kids will see that, we had our country, and it's great. That's why everyone wants to come here. What other reason do they want to come here? Yeah, come here and work. Pay taxes like everybody else. We'll live happily ever after. Hopefully one of these days.
I have a suggestion. I think this is a real good project on keeping the history, the verbal history. But I think something that always gets left behind is photographs. Just like the gentleman over that he was on this picture. His grandkids, unless somebody writes on the back of that photograph who it is, it just becomes another picture. And I think that's one thing that people it would be nice for kids to see. Well, this is your great-great-grandpa, great-great-great-grandmother, or whatever. But once our parents are gone, if they just become another picture. So it's not anything that's important. I think maybe if you guys can somehow put that into your important pictures.
Well, and one of the things that I was going to add, and thank you for bringing that up, is that we tried to ask when we were there, we have to go through the university's process, and so some things would have gotten tricky, like even asking to take pictures of participants sometimes is a problem just because of the university. That said, we were trying to ask if we had a scanner or a camera for a number of these, if people had pictures they wanted to share. And that includes if there's a picture, if you participated and you want to include your own picture, if you want to share any of that with us, we would love to include it in the file that we turn over to Farm and Ranch Heritage so that it's part of the permanent file that they have. That if you have pictures of the places you're talking about or you want to include any other pictures, including of yourselves, we will be happy to include those in there. So we can receive them in print version, but we can also receive them electronically if it's easier to just send a digital photo. With people's historic photos, I often want them to scan them and not give me the original for exactly that same reason. But as part of that, we're then also writing on it who it is. And so the stuff that came with the interview and the photos that came with the interview and the information that we got about them is something that's going to go in the files that get turned over to the museum, because that is such a big issue, is that it's hard not to have pictures. The voices are a really powerful thing, but images are really powerful too. And I have a number of my grandparents' photographs of people that I don't know who they are, and there's nobody living anymore who knows who they are, so they may be related to me. Probably.
They just become another person.
Right, yeah. And one of the other things, you all who participated in interviews, hopefully you have all received the audio of your interview. I hope you have. If you haven't, please tell us. But the other thing that we can do is make sure that you have the digital file of all of the photographs that you shared with whatever documentation we have. That way, you have that you have that as well. And I think we included what we did receive.
Yeah. So we're in an interesting time technologically, where sometimes we tried to have so Mariah and Kayla were our research assistants, especially Mariah has been helping us out a lot, and so we've had her call people to figure out what format they want things in, because the easiest way to put a lot of information is usually on a jump drive that we can send, and so we did a lot of that. That's also going to be probably the easiest way to share with a lot of family members, but not all of our participants have a computer or want to use a computer, and so we are also able to make music CDs, but those are not going to have, all you can put on those is recording, and so those are not going to have as much of the other stuff. But we do have the digital files from the initial recording that we tried to send everybody in whatever sort of format they wanted the recording, and that's yours. Make as many copies, shares with as many family members as possible. When we did do it on a jump drive, we would include the images that we had also on those jump drives that were provided to us in the interview. And we also have the possibility of when the transcripts are ready, and that's something that's taking a while. We have a few of them ready. We're kind of trying to wait until we all have them all so we can send them out. But we will be contacting you to figure out whether you want the paper or the digital form of the transcripts too. Another thing is that we are recording these talks, and we're doing it mostly for the evaluator. It's a larger file, but it's a bit more challenging, but especially those of you who've attended the talks, you've seen them, but especially if you weren't able to attend. So, for example, I've had to pull this up. This is from Mr. Springstead, who told a story about saving pie, which was Jimmy Stewart's favorite course, and it was not particularly related to our focus on rural history when we talked in Farmington, but I love the story, and Mariah loved the story, and so we found a picture and played the story at the end of that talk, and I just had to share the picture.
Good sense of humor.
It was a great, it involved horses and movies and westerns and meth, which made it a very New Mexican story. And so we have these talks that we've been recording on video as well, and so if that's something where somebody wasn't able to come and you want them to have access to see it, contact us, let us know, and then we'll figure out how we can manage to share them. It may be something that we can even do. One of the things we're hoping we can do is take the first part of the talk before we have the kind of people sharing stories, because in that case they haven't necessarily all agreed to have that be public. But that first part of the talk, which is us with the sound clips, is something that we might be able to post on YouTube as well, so that family members who weren't able to attend can still see it if they want to. So if that's something you're interested in, please just follow up with us. And we'll make sure to figure out how we can do it.
I would just really like to applaud you for going into high schools and talking to them about oral histories, because young people, they have no clue as to what their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents went through. I didn't know until I was in my late 30s, I think, that my dad worked in the shipyards in San Francisco during the war, and it's like, how could I not have known that? So much gets lost because young people just aren't interested until it's too late, really. So I really applaud you for going into a high school.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really good experience, and just so you know, there's hope. They were really interested. A lot of students were really interested, and it just had never maybe occurred to them that that's something that you could do. You can just talk to your family members and record those stories. So
it's just like one of my customers. I couldn't believe it. One day I was telling him how we make butter in the milk after we milk the cow, and my grandmother would let the cream rise to the top. And we'd come home, walk down from the school bus, which we had to travel 17 miles from Guerrero into Pecos. And in the wintertime, it was really rough, because we used to have to walk from the Guerrero post office all the way to the ranch house. Went back to the butter, and I would tell him, I said, Chris, yeah, we used to make it with the cream on top of it. No, you don't. You get it from the store. I said, Chris, I'm never going to let you down for this, but and I haven't.
Yeah, this is an unrelated study, but one of my colleagues does work on, she does food studies, and so she was talking to elementary school kids about where food comes from, was asking them, so, where does your chicken come from? The store. Like, where do those beans come from? the can. Like so there isn't really that sense that these things come from somewhere other before the store.
And you get kids interested in stuff like that, they just progress and they learn. They learn how to take care of things. It keeps you responsibility. That's what I learned on the ranch and stuff, And my daughter, she plants this, that, and the other, the whole works. Got right, live out there into the Moriarty area. I had a big big old garden, probably from that wall over to the TV, about this far. And it's not fun time. They used to go out there in the morning, pick it out of the garden and stuff like that, And it's great. The kids love it. Once you get them introduced to it, because this is such a new tool.
We are saying that the kids are not interested, but they are. They just don't know it. Because I remember when I was a kid, one time my grandpa started talking stories, and all the grandkids came together. And we never did before. He started talking, and we wanted to hear. We didn't thought about it. We didn't think about asking. No, my grandpa. But see, it's in our soul, but we just don't know it until somebody brings it up.
People like you can help us bring it out.
Yeah. That was our hope, that we were
It
hoping
seems like
to be
you
able
guys
to.
enjoy doing it too.
We love it.
And that's what makes a difference. You get somebody that you're really interested in it, and it can be boring, but God, he says it's and I think bringing it out to the schools, like she said, because they want to learn.
They just don't know.
And I'll bring Chris next time. I'll see if he wants to come in this week.
I know, I'm looking, I think our target audience is not that interested in this anymore. We lost him.
It's a great night.
I thank you guys so much for coming. I want to give a chance for those of you, I'm familiar with my students who say after 90 minutes their butt goes numb. So if you've got some place to go, you need to get up and walk around. Thank you guys so much for coming. If you want to come talk to us, if you've got questions, please come talk to us. I think, like Mary Alice said, we're pretty easy to reach, but I also have cards somewhere on that file. So if anybody needs to be able to have an email address, I can send you the card too. And phone number. Yeah, try the email address. Or leave a voicemail, because I'm really bad with my office phone.
All right, I actually don't have cards, but I can write my office phone number on her card. Call my office number. This is the important. Oh, thank you so much. I'm sorry I didn't miss you. I heard that this big hill here. I noticed there was several from our they're here.
Always wanted to see what I just told her I wanted to start doing yoga.
I know. See you later, Mike.
But I use everything that I can think of to get this horse intestine stimulated and start working again, and nothing was working. And I had oil on the stomach too, I've done everything. I said, we're done here. I said, we're not done, he's still breathing. We gotta do something, you gotta do something. And so I'm fumbling around through my bags and stuff, and I find a bottle of amphetamine. They used to sell amphetamine from the veterinary supply companies, a 250cc bottle. Can you believe that? Now, this is in 1969 or 1970. And so I looked at this bottle and I thought, oh, that's something I haven't tried. So I took about 20 cc's of this stuff. And I give it to him in the vein, and he started paddling and doing this left witty, and I thought, oh, that's the end of that. And then all of a sudden he stood up and just started looking around, and he started looking around this trail. And he goes in after about 3 times, running around the trail just flying. And he goes over and starts drinking water. I think that looks to me, he said, you did it. Get me to the bus. Because the plane didn't wait for me. So I got to catch a Greyhound bus back to Albuquerque. So I said, make sure when you come through Albuquerque, you stop at my clinic and let me check this horse. Because I want to make sure he's all right before I take the Santa Fe.
I'll send you the address.
Okay. Yes, you will.
Did you get to hear the whole thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Is there something on the back of my pants? Because I think there was something sticky in that chair.
Just have you
Is it okay?
Wind it. Wind it.
Oops. I'm not sure where you're going. I'm just here and back here to stop these.